Protests have erupted across Israel after the country's parliament, the Knesset, voted in favour of a controversial bill that limits the powers of the Supreme Court. Demonstrators waved Israeli flags and were chanting slogans against the move. Protesters blocked several roads in major cities. Police have made several arrests. The decision to cut down the court's power has led to months of protests by the opponents who call it an attack on democracy. The amendment won't come into force until it passes two more parliamentary votes. Let's bring in our correspondent, Tanya Kramer, here. She's in front of the Supreme Court in Jerusalem. Tanya, tell us what's happening there.
Well, just some time ago, there was a huge demonstration here, and this is what's happening, as you said, all day since the early morning. The protesters call this a day of disruption. So what they're doing is they're going from, in bigger junctions, like this one here behind me, there's still some protesters around trying to disrupt traffic. We've seen in the early morning they've been blocking the main highway between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. We've also seen, even here in front of the Supreme Court where I'm standing, water cannons were here, and also mounted police. Police were trying to get people off the main junction to make sure that the traffic can go through. And this is coming, of course, in a response to this bill that was passed in the first reading, just not very far from here in the Knesset on Monday night by the lawmakers of the far-right government.
Dramatic scenes there. What is it exactly that makes this proposed legislation so controversial? If it does become law, what would it mean for the people of Israel?
Well, protesters here say this is a key moment, actually, in this whole long process. They have been protesting for 6 months now with no let-up every Saturday, but also during other days and times. So this bill is basically to restrict the power of the Supreme Court to block government decisions of elected government officials and what they deem is unreasonable or implausible. And one of the examples that often is referred to here, for example, this government wanted to reappoint the leader of the Shas party is part of the coalition government of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, but the Supreme Court said this is not reasonable because he had been convicted earlier for corruption charges. So, of course, this bill is just passed now in the first reading. It's now going back into the committee. There is some talk that they might try to soften a bit the language there, the wording of this bill. It still needs to go to a second and third reading, but the government here has said those want to push ahead with what they call a judicial reform, what the protesters call a judicial overhaul. They said they want to push it through before the end of this Knesset session, which is by the end of July.
Now, these protests, as you mentioned, Tanya, have been going on for months. How much of a threat do they pose to Netanyahu's government?
Well, I think Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has a very comfortable majority in his government, but what the protesters have managed so far is to block, basically to slow down this judicial overhaul. But what we are seeing right now, what the government is trying to do is to pass it law by law, what some here call the salami tactic. So they pass a law here, a law there, and then move on. But I think what it has done is actually bringing this country really apart, tearing it apart. And we're hearing again what we've seen in the past month, groups that are very essential here, like from the high tech, from the security. Again, this morning, we understand the volunteer pilots and the cyber specialist intelligence units, saying they will not report for reserve duty if this continues. So it's really tearing the country apart in its essentials.
Tanya, thank you very much. That was our correspondent, Tanya Kramer, in Jerusalem.